It was 11:52 on a Wednesday night when my phone lit up with an unknown number, and the only reason I answered was because my reading glasses were already on, and I figured it might be my brother calling from a different hotel room somewhere out west. It wasn't my brother. Mr. Calloway? The voice was young, female, and tight with something that sounded like controlled fear. My name is Christine Webb. I'm a CPA at Hargrove and Associates. We handle your estate tax filings. I need you to listen carefully, and I need you to please not tell your son that I called you tonight. I set down the glass of warm milk I'd been nursing, Eleanor's old remedy for sleeplessness that I'd never quite given up after she died, and I sat up straighter in my armchair. Outside the window of my Columbus home, the October rain tapped against the glass. Inside, the house was the specific kind of quiet that only widowers understand. Go ahead, I said. 2 hours ago, I was finishing the quarterly review on your accounts. Something flagged in our system. A series of wire transfers, 14 of them over the past 8 months, all going to the same entity, a company called Blue Ridge Ventures, LLC, registered in Delaware. Mr. Calloway, that company was formed 7 months ago, and I cannot find any legitimate business purpose for it connected to your portfolio. She paused. When I ran the authorization signatures on file, our handwriting verification software flagged 11 of the 14 as having significant inconsistencies with your authentic signature on record. The rain ticked against the window. How much? I asked. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. $231,000. But Mr. Calloway, that's not the part that made me call you at midnight from my personal cell. Another pause. I heard her take a breath. Your son is listed as the sole managing member of Blue Ridge Ventures, LLC. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I was 64 years old. I had spent 38 years as a civil engineer, designing bridges that had to hold weight they weren't always built for. I knew what structural failure looked like. I knew the moment before a load-bearing element gave way, that particular silence before everything shifted. My son, I said quietly. Yes, sir. And there's one more thing. She sounded like she was steadying herself. You're scheduled to leave for Ketchikan, Alaska on Friday morning. A week-long fishing charter that your son booked. She hesitated. I looked up the charter company. The boat operates in the Inside Passage. Mr. Calloway, some of those fjords, if something happened out there, far from shore, in weather that changes in 20 minutes, the recovery rate for accidents is very low. I stood up, without realizing I was doing it, and walked to the window. The street outside was empty and wet and familiar in a way that suddenly felt precious. I'd bought this house in 1987, when Eleanor was pregnant with our son, and we thought the future was a door we could just keep walking through. Miss Webb, I said, why are you calling me? You could have filed an internal report. Let compliance handle it. Why risk your job to call a client you've never met at midnight? The silence on her end lasted long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. My grandfather, she finally said. He was an iron worker. Retired. Lived in Pittsburgh. After my grandmother died, his caregiver started taking money from him. Small amounts at first, then larger. By the time anyone realized, she'd taken almost everything he'd saved in 40 years. He died in a county care facility. We'd visit him on weekends, and he couldn't understand why his savings were gone. He'd ask me if he'd done something wrong. Her voice tightened. I went into forensic accounting because of him. When I saw this pattern tonight, the amounts escalating, the timing, that fishing trip, I thought about him. I thought about how nobody caught it in time for him. I'm not letting that happen to someone else if I can help it. I gripped the windowsill with my free hand. Thank you, I said. It felt completely inadequate. Can you give me until Friday? Can you stall any pending transfers for 72 hours without tipping anyone off? Our compliance policy allows me to place a monitoring hold on suspicious activity for up to 96 hours. I can do it under routine review language. Your son won't be notified. Do it. And Miss Webb, keep a copy of everything. Everything you found tonight. Don't let it exist only on the firm's server. Already done, she said. I printed hard copies before I called you. After we hung up, I stood at that window for a long time without moving. The rain had eased to a mist. Down the block, The Hendersons' porch light was on, the way it always was. A little yellow beacon that had been there since before Eleanor and I moved in, before our son took his first steps in this driveway, before any of it. My son. He'd been attentive since Eleanor passed 3 years ago. Unusually attentive, I'd thought. But I'd told myself that was grief talking, that suspicious minds were a symptom of loss. He'd driven down from Cincinnati every other weekend. He'd brought his wife, my daughter-in-law, a woman I'd never quite warmed to but had accepted because she made my son happy. Or at least, that was what he said. He'd started talking about my finances with a new kind of concern. "Dad, have you updated your will since Mom? Dad, you really should have everything organized. What if something happened to you?" 3 months ago, he'd brought an estate attorney to my house. Young guy with a good handshake and a folder full of documents. Quick meeting, lots of legal language. My son reassuring me the whole time that it was standard stuff, just updating things for the modern era. I'd signed where they told me to sign. I walked to my study and found the folder I'd filed those documents in. I'd been an engineer. I kept records. I pulled out the papers and sat down at my desk and read every word of every page. It took me an hour. The language was dense, deliberately so. But I found it, buried in an amendment to my existing power of attorney, 5 pages in a subsection labeled Financial Management Authority. Effective immediately upon signing. Unlimited access to all accounts, investment portfolios, and real property. My son's name. His wife's name, as secondary. I had signed over financial control of everything I had built in 38 working years to my son, and I had done it because he'd handed me a pen and told me it was routine. My retirement accounts, the equity in this house, the trust fund Eleanor and I had built carefully over decades, $2.8 million in total, plus the house worth another $900,000. Everything. My hands weren't shaking. I've noticed that about myself. In moments of genuine shock, I go very still. Surgeons have that sometimes. Engineers too. When the situation is genuinely catastrophic, the body stops trembling and starts calculating. I called my oldest friend, a man I'd known since graduate school who'd retired from the Columbus Police Department 4 years ago as a lieutenant. He answered on the 3rd ring, groggy and immediately alert when he heard my voice. "Tell me," he said. I told him. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You still going on that fishing trip Friday?" "I think I have to." "Robert." He only used my first name when he was serious. "If what this accountant is saying is accurate, and it sounds like it is Alaska, a charter boat, remote water that's not a vacation, that's a location chosen because accidents happen there and don't get solved." "I know. Then you're not going as a fish." "I'm going as bait," I said. "But only if I have people around me. Can you help me put that together?" He exhaled slowly. "I know a retired marshal who does private security work in Juneau. Man named Garrett. Former fugitive recovery. He knows those waters. If I call him tonight, he can be in Ketchikan before your charter leaves. Make the call." I spent the rest of that night reading. Not my documents. I'd already read everything I needed to read. I read the old journals Eleanor kept during her illness. She'd filled 3 of them in the last year of her life, and I'd never been able to open them until about 6 months after she was gone. I read them now because I needed to remember what I was fighting for. Eleanor had wanted this house to become a foundation someday. She had wanted the money we'd saved to mean something beyond our own comfort scholarships for engineering students from working-class families, the way we'd both been working-class kids who'd needed someone's help to get through school. She had talked about leaving something for our son, but carefully. "He has to earn his life," she'd written in one of the journals. "We love him, but we can't hand him an identity. That wouldn't be love." She'd known something I hadn't been willing to see. At 7 in the morning, I called my personal attorney, a woman who had handled my contracts since I went independent in my mid-40s. I told her to meet me at her office that morning and to clear her schedule. Then I called my physician, a man I'd known for 20 years, and asked him to see me urgently. Then I called Christine Webb at a reasonable hour and asked her to meet me at a coffee shop downtown at 9 o'clock. She was younger than her voice had suggested, maybe 28, 29, with steady eyes and a messenger bag she clutched, like it contained something important, which it did. She had printed 12 pages of account statements, transfer records, and the LLC registration documents for Blue Ridge Ventures. She spread them on the table between us like someone laying out a case, which she also was. "I want you to know," she said, "that I submitted my monitoring hold this morning under routine review language. Nobody at the firm has flagged it yet, but if your son's attorney checks with the bank, they may eventually see the hold. How long do we have? Realistically, 72 hours, maybe 96. I looked at the records she'd brought. 14 transfers. The first one had been for $4,200, small enough to look like a miscellaneous expense. Then $8,500. Then $12, each one a little larger. The way you test a fence before you lean your full weight on it. He was practicing, I said. Yes. The early signatures are rougher. By transfers 11 through 14, they're quite good. But our system compares every signature against the original on file from account opening. His 11th attempt scored 78%. That's below our threshold for large transfers. What made you look that closely? Most people would have just processed it. She folded her hands on the table. The amount on transfer 14 was $340,000. That's large enough to trigger a secondary review. When I pulled the file and ran all the signatures together, the pattern became obvious. Someone had been learning. She paused. And then, I saw the Alaska trip on your travel alerts. I reached across the table and shook her hand formally, the way you do when you want someone to understand that you mean something seriously. You may have saved my life, Miss Webb. I want you to know I understand that. She nodded and looked down at the table. Please, just come home from Alaska, she said. My attorney took 2 hours to review everything that morning. Her office was on the 14th floor of a building I'd helped design 20 years ago, and I looked out at the city while she read, thinking about all the things I'd built that were still standing. The POA amendment is legally executed, she told me, pulling off her reading glasses. If he signed your name on those transfers, that's forgery. If he used the POA fraudulently, that's elder financial abuse under Ohio statute, which carries enhanced penalties. The Delaware LLC, if we can show it was created as a vehicle for fraud, the transfers are recoverable. She leaned forward. We need to file an emergency petition to revoke the POA before Friday, or at least initiate the process. And you need documented proof of your cognitive competence, because the moment this goes to court, they will argue you didn't understand what you signed. I already scheduled the medical evaluation for this afternoon. She almost smiled. You thought of that yourself. I'm an engineer. I think in load-bearing structures. By Thursday evening, I had a complete medical workup cognitive assessment, full physical, blood panel signed and notarized by my physician, documenting clearly that Robert James Calloway, age 64, was in full possession of his mental faculties and physical health, and had no legitimate need for a guardian or financial custodian. My attorney had filed the emergency petition to revoke the POA. My retired lieutenant friend had reached his contact in Juneau. A man named Garrett was already in Ketchikan, had already located the charter company, and had booked himself onto a different boat leaving from the same marina on the same morning. Friday morning, my son picked me up at 6:30. He pulled into the driveway in his SUV, stepped out, smiling, wearing new outdoor gear that still had the fold creases in it. My daughter-in-law waved from the passenger seat. I hugged my son on the front porch of the house I'd lived in for 37 years, and I held on to him for a moment longer than he expected. Ready for the big trip, Dad? He said, patting my back. I've been looking forward to it, I said. That was true, once. When he'd first proposed it 4 months ago, Dad, just you and me, Alaska. The way we always talked about it, I'd felt something warm open up in my chest. I'd thought it was the beginning of something. At the airport, my daughter-in-law handed me a travel mug of coffee. I made it myself, she said, extra strong for the early flight. I thanked her and drank from a bottle of water I'd brought from home instead, when neither of them was watching. On the plane, my son sat in the middle seat between me and the aisle. He was attentive in a way that felt measured, calibrated. He offered me his pillow, He asked 3 times if I was comfortable. He suggested I take one of the sleep aids he'd brought, just a light one. "Dad, the flight's long and you should rest." I declined, said I'd brought my own. I didn't take anything. Ketchikan was gray and cold and beautiful in that specific Alaskan way, where the beauty feels indifferent to you, which is its own kind of honesty. The marina smelled like salt and diesel. Our charter, a 42-foot vessel called the Resolute, was already docked and ready. The captain was a compact man in his 50s with a weathered face and the particular quiet of someone who has spent decades on open water. We were the only passengers. The inside passage is spectacular. I want to be clear about that. Even under the circumstances, even knowing what I knew, I stood at the stern of that boat on the first morning and watched the mountains rise from the water on both sides and felt the particular enormity of a landscape that doesn't care about human problems, which is sometimes exactly what a human problem needs. My son fished. He was good at it, actually. I watched him from my spot on the rear bench, this 40-year-old man I had raised, and I tried to remember who he'd been when he was 7, 8, 9, before whatever had gone wrong inside him had gone wrong. He'd been a serious child. Careful. Not warm, exactly, but curious. Eleanor had worried about him sometimes, quietly, in ways she tried not to let me see. On the second evening, the captain anchored in a cove about 11 miles from the nearest town. Garrett had texted me that morning. On water, clear sightline, within radio range of Coast Guard, standing by. I'd waved my right hand off the stern casually at nothing in particular. Somewhere across that dark water, someone was watching. Dinner was canned soup and good bread the captain had baked himself. My son drank 2 glasses of whiskey, which was one more than usual. My daughter-in-law, we'd brought her 2, which I hadn't expected, sat across from me and asked about my estate plan with a brightness in her voice that didn't match her eyes. "We were thinking," she said, "that with the market the way it is, it might make sense to liquidate some of the older investment accounts, put the money somewhere with better returns." "What did you have in mind?" I asked. My son set down his whiskey glass. "Blue Ridge has been doing well. Private equity. We could move a portion into it. Something managed." I looked at my son across the small table of a boat anchored in an Alaskan cove at 8 o'clock in the evening. I looked at him and tried to find the child I remembered, the boy who'd cried at his mother's funeral and gripped my arm so hard I had a bruise for a week after. "Let me think about it," I said. "What's the rush?" Something moved behind his eyes. "No rush. Just want to make sure you're taken care of." That night I wedged a chair under the door handle of my small cabin and sat in the dark, listening to the water move against the hull. At 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps on the deck above me. They stopped outside my cabin door for 43 seconds, I counted, and then moved away. In the morning, I said nothing about it. I made myself coffee and went on deck and watched the sun come through the cloud cover in long, slanted lines and thought about Eleanor, the way I always did in beautiful places, the way I always would. The confrontation came on the 3rd afternoon, which I'd known it would. My son suggested we take the Zodiac inflatable to a small island about a 1/4 mile from where we'd anchored. "Better fishing off the rocks over there," he said. "Private, just us." I agreed. The captain watched us go with a face that gave nothing away. I'd had a quiet conversation with him the previous morning while my son slept in, and he knew what to watch for. The island was a pile of rock and scrub pine about the size of a city block. We dragged the Zodiac up a gravel beach and walked around to the seaward side, where the rocks dropped straight into deep water, 60 or 70 feet to the surface, and who knew how far down from there. My son set up his rod. I sat on a flat rock and watched the water. "You seem different this trip," he said after a while. "Do I?" Quieter. He reeled in and cast again. "Something on your mind?" "I've been thinking about your mother," I said. Which was true. "Do you remember the summer she got her diagnosis? You were 37. You flew home and we sat in this kitchen, and she made us eat grilled cheese sandwiches because she said she wasn't going to spend her diagnosis day crying. She was going to spend it feeding people." He didn't turn around. "I remember. She talked about what she wanted her life to mean. She talked about that foundation we'd discussed for years. Engineering scholarships. She was very specific about it." I paused. She talked about you too. She said she hoped you'd find something that made you proud of yourself. That was the word she used. Proud. He was still facing the water. His shoulders had gone rigid. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket and opened the documents Christine Webb had sent me. I walked up beside him and held the phone out. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Transfer number 1, I said. February 14th. $4,200. Blue Ridge Ventures LLC. I scrolled down. Transfer 14. September 22nd. $340,000. Blocked. Because the signature was wrong. Not wrong enough for the first 13 you'd gotten good by then, but the software still caught it. He set down his fishing rod carefully, like someone buying time. Dad, a young woman named Christine Webb called me at midnight on Wednesday. She works at Hargrove and Associates. She's 29 years old and she went into forensic accounting because her grandfather was robbed blind by someone he trusted, and she couldn't stand the idea of that happening to someone else. My voice was steady. I had planned to be angry and discovered I was something else, instead sad, in a way that had no bottom to it. She saved my life, I think. This place you brought me to, I've looked at these waters. You didn't bring me here to fish. You don't know what you're talking about. But his voice had gone thin. The life insurance policy, I said. Taken out 4 months ago. $2 million. Beneficiary. Blue Ridge Ventures. Your company. I put my phone back in my pocket. I'm 64, not senile. How long have you been planning this? He sat down on the rocks. It wasn't a collapse exactly, more like something going out of him. We're almost $1 million in debt, he said. Her business failed. I had investments that went wrong. We've been the collectors are calling every day. I don't sleep. I haven't slept in a year. So you decided to speed up my timeline. He flinched. It wasn't supposed to be. He stopped. Then what was it supposed to be? Taking the money slowly wasn't enough. You needed me to have an accident in Alaska. I didn't. He pressed his hands against his face. She came up with the Alaska part. I told her no. I told her we weren't doing that. But you got on the boat. The silence between us had geography. It had distance in it that had nothing to do with the water. Do you remember when you were 8? I said. And you broke the living room window trying to throw a ball over the house? You came inside and sat at the kitchen table waiting for me to get home, and you had this look on your face like you'd already decided to tell me the truth and you were terrified, but you'd decided. That was one of the proudest moments I ever had as your father. Not the window. The deciding. I looked at him. I kept waiting for that. This past year, every time you came to the house with those documents, every time you talked about my finances with that particular brightness, I kept waiting for you to sit down at the table. He was crying. I hadn't seen him cry since Eleanor's funeral. I'm going to give you the same choice you gave yourself at 8 years old, I said. You can tell me everything, every transfer, every document, every conversation you had with that attorney you brought to my house. Everything. Or, I gestured at the water. You can try whatever it was you came here to try. But I want you to know that there's a man named Garrett about 400 yards off that eastern point right now in a powerboat with a radio and a very long lens. And the captain knows to call the Coast Guard if that Zodiac comes back without both of us. My son looked out at the water, at the long gray horizon, at the indifferent mountains. Then he sat down on the rocks and he talked for 2 hours. The Coast Guard met us at the marina. Garrett had called ahead. My daughter-in-law, who had stayed on the Resolute, was very quiet when the officers arrived, and I understood from that quietness that she had known more than my son wanted to believe she hadn't. I stood on the dock in the Ketchikan afternoon and watched my son be escorted to a waiting vehicle, and I felt something I didn't have a name for. Not triumph, not even relief. Something that felt like the specific exhaustion of a long load finally set down the weight still in your muscles, even though your hands are empty. The next 3 weeks were logistics. My attorney was thorough and merciless in the best professional sense. The fraudulent POA was revoked. The 14 transfers were reversed through civil action. Blue Ridge Ventures had been dissolved the morning after my son's arrest, but the money was traceable. I recovered $198,000 of the $231,000 directly. My son's attorney argued diminished capacity, marital pressure, financial desperation. The prosecutor noted that diminished capacity doesn't explain 14 months of careful planning. My son was sentenced to 6 years. My daughter-in-law, who had participated in the estate planning deception and the insurance policy, was sentenced to 4. I attended neither sentencing. I'd said what I needed to say in Alaska. The week after the sentencing, I drove to the offices of Hargrove and Associates and asked to see Christine Webb. She came out to the lobby looking careful, the way people look when they're not sure what they're walking into. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I need to give you something," I said, "and I need you to accept it without arguing." I handed her a check. The number on it was significant. I'd spent a week deciding what felt right, and then I doubled it, because Eleanor had always said I underestimated the value of a right thing done at the right time. Christine Webb looked at the check. She opened her mouth and then closed it. "You flew to Ketchikan on your own time," I said. "You brought hard copies of every document to the Ketchikan police station and sat with them for 6 hours while they processed everything. You paid for your own hotel for 2 nights. I'd found all of this out afterward, from my attorney who'd coordinated with the investigators. You didn't have to do any of that. Your obligation ended when you made that phone call. I wanted to make sure it worked," she said quietly. "It worked because of you." I paused. "Your grandfather's name?" "William. I'm establishing a scholarship fund at Ohio State's accounting program. It will be called the William Webb Award for Forensic Integrity. I'll need your help naming the criteria. I want it to go to students who are interested in financial fraud prevention, specifically elder financial protection." I watched her face. It seemed right. He should be the reason other people get protected. She pressed her lips together hard and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "One more thing," I said. "I've spoken with 2 partners at Hargrove. They know what you did, the full picture. Not just the compliance hold. All of it. The midnight call, the printed documents. Alaska. I let that land. They're creating a new position. Senior Forensic Review. You'll build the department." She looked at me for a long time. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked. "You could have just sent the check, because your grandfather deserved someone who did all of this for him," I said. "And nobody did. The least I can do is make sure the person who finally showed up for someone like him knows that it matters. That she matters." She didn't cry. Exactly. But it was close. I drove home to Columbus that afternoon, back to the house on the quiet street where Eleanor and I had planted maple trees in the front yard 30 years ago that were now tall enough to shade the whole porch. I sat in the armchair where I'd taken Christine's call, and I looked around at the room, the engineering texts still on the shelf. Eleanor's reading chair at the angle she'd always preferred. The family photographs on the mantle that were going to need editing now, and that I wasn't ready to edit yet. I called my attorney. We spent 2 weeks rewriting everything. The foundation in Eleanor's name was formally established, the Eleanor Calloway Engineering Access Foundation, funding need-based scholarships for first-generation engineering students. The house would go to it eventually. The remainder of the estate, everything that was left after the reverse transfers and the legal costs, was directed to a combination of free clinic funding and the scholarship program. The William Webb Award was endowed separately, its own entity, properly structured so that no family drama could ever redirect it. I did set aside something for my son's children, if he ever had any. Carefully structured, delayed, conditional on things I could not control. Eleanor would have said to leave the door open. I left it open a crack. It's been 4 years now. I moved out of the house last spring. Not to a senior community picked by someone else, but to a smaller place I chose myself. 20 minutes from the university where I now teach 2 sections of structural engineering to undergraduates who are mostly 20 years old and occasionally brilliant. I volunteer twice a week at a legal aid clinic that helps elderly clients review financial documents before they sign them. The number of people who come in holding papers they don't fully understand would alarm you. It alarms me every week, and I keep going back. Christine Webb's Forensic Review Department at Hargrove and Associates now has 4 staff members. She called me last spring to tell me that her team had flagged a financial exploitation scheme involving an elderly client in Dayton caught it before any significant money moved, and worked with local prosecutors to bring charges. She said she'd thought of me. I told her I thought of her grandfather. My son will be eligible for early release in 2 years. I don't know if I'll write a letter to the board. Some days I think I will. Most days I sit with it and don't decide. What I know is this. I came closer than I understood to being another name in a statistic. Another elderly man with money and a family who loved what he had more than who he was. I would have trusted my way into an Alaskan fjord, and nobody would have questioned the story because the story would have been simple and sad and the kind of thing people shake their heads about and then move on from. I'm still here because a 29-year-old woman looked at a spreadsheet at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night and thought of her grandfather and picked up her personal cell phone and called a stranger. I think about William Webb sometimes, the iron worker from Pittsburgh who spent 40 years building things and died in a county facility wondering what had happened to his savings, with nobody catching it in time. I think about how close that was to my story. How many William Webbs there are, right now, in houses just like mine, signing documents they trust because the person handing them the pen is someone they love. And I think about the people like Christine, the ones who are paying attention, who are willing to risk something for a stranger, who carry their grief about the ones they couldn't save into the work of saving someone else. Family, Eleanor used to say, is the people who show up. She was right, as she almost always was. She just never specified that showing up could mean a midnight phone call from someone you've never met, someone whose grandfather you never knew, someone who decided that this time, this one time, nobody was going to be too late.